My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 48 years old. For most of my adult life, I was the dependable one, the kind of person family leaned on when things got messy. I worked hard, saved wisely, and when my parents passed away, I inherited their home. It wasn't a mansion, but it was steady, warm, and full of history. To me, it was more than just four walls. It was proof that all the years of quiet sacrifice, all the times I chose responsibility over indulgence, meant something. I've never been loud or demanding in my family. I was the one who showed up early to gatherings, who paid attention when others tuned out, who covered the bill when my siblings conveniently forgot their wallets. Over the years, I noticed small cracks forming. Moments of entitlement, words tossed too casually, expectations that felt heavier each year. But I told myself it was family. Family deserves patience. Family deserves grace. I swallowed more than I should have. The truth is, betrayal rarely comes in a sudden strike. It builds in whispers, in the small assumptions people make about you. My sister Claire had a habit of assuming my life existed as a safety net for hers. If she overspent, I would help. If she fell behind on rent, I would cover it. She called it sibling loyalty. I called it love. But looking back, it was dependency disguised as affection. The breaking point came at what should have been an ordinary family dinner. I can still picture the table, my brother cracking jokes, my niece playing with her food, the clinking of glasses. Then Claire, without hesitation, looked across the table at me and said, "Mum and Dad promised I could live with you." She said it not as a request, not as a conversation, but as a declaration, as if my home was already hers. Everyone went quiet. Forks froze midair. My chest tightened, but my face didn't move. I sipped my water, steady, unflinching. In that moment, every memory of giving, every sacrifice, every instance of being taken for granted collapsed into a single truth. She didn't see me as a brother, she saw me as a resource, and I realized I had been complicit in letting her believe it. I set the glass down, looked her in the eyes, and spoke calmly, almost casually. "That's awkward. I sold the house last Friday to a couple." I let the words hang in the air. No anger, no justification, just the truth. And for the first time in my life, silence felt like my ally. Silence has a way of replaying itself long after the words are spoken. That night, after the dinner ended in a storm of confused glances and Claire's disbelief, I sat alone in my car and let the weight of it all settle in. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but tense. I wasn't angry, not in the way people imagine anger. No shouting, no pounding fists. It was something deeper, something quieter, a realization that years of loyalty had been mistaken for weakness, that I had been living in a story where I was cast as the dependable character, while others rewrote my life without ever asking if I agreed to the script. As I drove home, memories flickered like old film reels. Claire calling me at midnight because she needed just a little help with rent. My brother borrowing tools and never returning them. The way family reunions always seemed to orbit around what I could provide, not who I was. I thought about how many times I had excused it with lines like "that's just how they are," or "family comes first." But under those excuses was a truth I didn't want to face. I had been sacrificing my boundaries for people who mistook sacrifice for obligation. I remembered the last conversation I had with my parents before they passed. My father, frail but sharp-eyed, told me, "Daniel, a house is just a building unless you guard what it means." At the time, I thought he meant upkeep, maintenance, paying the bills on time. Only now did I understand he was speaking of something larger, of guarding meaning, guarding dignity, guarding self-respect. By allowing others to assume control, I had let the meaning of that home slip away. The hardest part wasn't losing the house itself. I had chosen to sell it because I needed closure, a fresh start. The hardest part was realizing I had missed the signs all along. Every entitled comment, every expectation, every "you'll take care of it, won't you?" should have been a red flag. But I silenced those alarms out of fear. Fear of being the difficult one, fear of breaking the fragile thread that held us together as a family. That fear became a cage. In the days that followed, Claire didn't speak to me. She sent messages, then accusations, then silence. My brother tried to play mediator, telling me I could have handled it differently. But deep down, I knew I had finally handled it the only way left, by refusing to play the role I'd been assigned. Still, beneath the calm exterior, I wrestled with questions that gnawed at me in the quiet hours. Had I betrayed my family by protecting myself, or had I finally stopped betraying myself by protecting them? Every morning, I sat with my coffee and let the questions burn through me. I didn't regret selling the house, not for a second. But I did feel the sting of a truth too many people learn too late. Loyalty without boundaries is not love, it is self-erasure, and in choosing to draw the line, I was beginning to reclaim the pieces of myself I had given away so freely. When you stop reacting, you start noticing. That was the first lesson I learned after the dinner. I didn't argue, I didn't chase explanations, I didn't try to smooth things over. Instead, I began observing in silence every word, every tone, every expectation that had once passed over me without question. I noticed how my siblings only called when they needed something. I noticed how in conversations they spoke of our family legacy, but somehow that legacy always seemed to rest on my shoulders. It wasn't just about the house, it was about a pattern that had been stitched into every part of my life. In that silence I began planning, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I understood that revenge, if it were to mean anything, had to be quiet, intelligent, and precise, not screaming in their faces or throwing past favors back at them. No, my revenge would be measured. It would be reclaiming my independence, cutting the strings they thought they held, and showing them that the foundation they leaned on was never theirs to own. I started by reviewing everything I had kept hidden out of modesty: bank accounts, investments, property records. Over the years, I had built more stability than I ever shared with them. They believed the house was the crown jewel of my life, the only thing worth clinging to. But they didn't know the depth of the roots I had planted elsewhere. Quietly, I made sure those roots were untouchable, shielded by trusts and careful paperwork. If they had imagined they could guilt me into being their safety net, they would soon learn that the safety net had already been pulled away. The next step was psychological, not financial. I stopped saying yes. I stopped returning calls that began with, "I hate to ask," but I stopped cushioning their poor decisions with my steady presence. I let the silence answer for me, and in that silence I saw panic. My brother, who often leaned on me for advice, suddenly stumbled in his work. Claire, who believed she had a guaranteed place in my life, began reaching out with nervous tones, as if sensing the ground shifting beneath her. I said little, but I was listening to everything. And then came the moment of leverage. Claire had told friends she would be moving into my home. Word had spread in the family that I would take care of her. It was an assumption turned into gossip, gossip turned into certainty. When those same friends later asked her how the move was going, she had no answer, because the house wasn't hers to inherit, and the life she imagined had evaporated. That embarrassment wasn't my doing, not directly. It was the quiet weight of truth catching up with her words. I didn't gloat, I didn't lecture, I didn't confront. I simply continued to live. And in living calmly, deliberately, with boundaries sharper than they had ever been, I discovered something more powerful than confrontation: control. Real control. Not over them, but over myself, and that was the leverage that would eventually undo their hold on me. The unraveling didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It happened slowly, like threads being pulled from a sweater, until the whole fabric lost its shape. At first, Claire tried to laugh off what happened at the dinner, framing it as a misunderstanding. But underneath her smile, I could see the cracks forming. She had told too many people too many times that she was set for life because of me. And when the truth began to spread, that the house was gone, that she had no claim, her image started to crumble. People whispered. Some pitied her, others quietly mocked her. She wasn't used to being exposed, and the weight of that humiliation grew heavier with each passing week. I kept my distance, watching it unfold. She reached out once, her voice sharp, demanding to know why I hadn't told her sooner about the sale. I listened, silent on the other end, and when she paused to catch her breath, I simply said, "Because it was never your house." Nothing more, no arguments, no raised voice, just truth. She hung up on me, but I knew those words would echo louder than anything else I could have said. Meanwhile, my brother began to stumble in ways I hadn't expected. For years he had leaned on me for quiet advice about work, about finances, about life. Without realizing it, I had become his anchor. But now that I had withdrawn, he floundered. His decisions grew reckless, his confidence faltered, and soon the same people who once looked up to him began to see the instability beneath his surface. Again, I said nothing. I let silence do its work. The irony was sharp. For so long my family had seen me as the quiet one, the man in the background, the dependable shadow. They never understood that shadows are only cast by light, and without me, much of their supposed certainty began to fade. They thought they had control. Now, piece by piece, that illusion slipped from their hands. Claire's desperation grew obvious. She started showing up at gatherings with excuses, blaming me for her struggles, painting herself as the victim. But even then, she couldn't mask the truth. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more people saw through it, and the less I responded, the more her words betrayed her. She was losing control not because I fought her, but because I refused to fight at all. I realized then that revenge doesn't need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is stand still while the storm consumes the ones who tried to use you. In my stillness, they began to collapse. In my silence, their own voices destroyed them, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of years of exploitation lift off my shoulders. I didn't need to prove anything to them. The truth was already proving itself. The collapse came not with a bang, but with quiet, steady erosion. Claire's once confident smile grew brittle, her voice sharper, her excuses thinner. She began arriving late to dinners she used to dominate, her shoulders hunched, her laughter forced. I watched from my seat, calm, steady, not out of cruelty but clarity. For the first time I wasn't the one carrying the invisible burden of making everything right. I wasn't patching holes in her stories, wasn't covering her debts, wasn't softening the truth for her. And without that safety net, she stumbled publicly in ways I had only ever seen privately. The family noticed, even if they didn't say it aloud. My brother, who once leaned on me for silent support, was now fumbling under the weight of his own pride. He made promises he couldn't keep, decisions that backfired. And when he looked at me with the familiar pleading in his eyes, I did not look away, but I did not step in either. My silence was my boundary, and boundaries, I discovered, are the quietest form of justice. I didn't need apologies from them. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation where truth spilled out in anger. Their unraveling was apology enough. It showed me what I had always suspected, that the strength of their lives had been borrowed from mine. And when I stopped lending, they were forced to stand on their own legs. Some couldn't. And that wasn't my responsibility anymore. There were whispers in the wider family now, whispers I never fueled. Daniel always seemed so stable. I guess we know why now. I kept my head down, kept working, kept living. I let them write their own narratives about me. But the important part was this. For once, I wasn't living according to the script others had assigned me. I had written my own ending to the story they thought they controlled, and in doing so, I discovered that revenge isn't about destruction, it's about liberation. The sweetest moment came unexpectedly. At a family gathering months later, someone asked Claire where she was living now. She stumbled, fumbled for words, and her eyes darted toward me, as if expecting me to rescue her like I always had. But I just sipped my drink, calm and collected, and let the silence answer for me. That silence was years of repayment in a single breath. It was justice without lifting a hand or raising a voice. And strangely enough, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Watching them falter without my constant sacrifice didn't fill me with joy. It filled me with release. I realized revenge hadn't been the point all along. The point was reclaiming myself, reclaiming the dignity I had traded for loyalty, and now standing quietly in that room, while the weight shifted back to its rightful owners, I finally felt the balance restored. Peace doesn't come in a grand announcement. It arrives slowly, like dawn light spilling across a dark room. I woke up one morning, months after that family dinner, and realized I no longer carried their weight. I no longer replayed the words, no longer rehearsed what I should have said. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like air, light, breathable, mine. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waking up to solve someone else's problems. I was waking up to live my own life. I began to see the world differently. Even small things felt like freedom. Walking into my kitchen and knowing every decision, every purchase, every corner of that home was mine. Not inherited expectation, not family obligation, but mine. I started cooking meals I wanted, not the ones I thought would keep others satisfied. I rearranged the furniture, painted walls, planted flowers in the garden. Each act, however small, was a declaration. This life belongs to me now. Closure with Claire and my brother never came through words. They didn't apologize, and I never asked them to. Instead, closure came through distance. By choosing myself, I forced them to face themselves. They had to find other crutches, other shoulders to lean on. And while I heard through relatives that they struggled, I no longer felt responsible. Their struggles were no longer my storms to weather. I learned something vital. Freedom isn't the absence of people, it's the presence of boundaries. And boundaries are the invisible lines that keep your dignity intact. It took me nearly 50 years to draw mine, but once I did, everything changed. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't vengeful. I was free. There were nights I sat outside, under quiet skies, thinking about my parents. I wondered what they would have said if they could see this moment. I think my father would have been proud, not because I sold the house, but because I guarded the meaning behind it. I guarded myself. My mother would have reminded me that love without respect is not love at all, and in that thought I found comfort. So yes, revenge had been the spark, but redemption was the fire that kept me warm. By letting them lose control, I had regained mine, and that, I realized, was the only ending I needed. Freedom has a strange taste when you've been starved of it for years. At first, I didn't quite know what to do with it. I had built my entire adulthood around meeting needs that weren't mine, around carrying responsibilities I never asked for. Now, with that weight gone, I had space, but space can feel both liberating and terrifying. The silence that once shielded me now asked a question. What do you want for yourself, Daniel? For the first time in decades, I didn't have an immediate answer. I started slowly. Small routines became rituals of self-respect. I took long walks in the evenings, not because I needed to clear my head of family drama, but because I wanted to enjoy the air. I began reading books that had sat untouched on my shelves, the kind I always promised myself I'd get to when things settled down. And as I turned the pages, I realized life had finally settled, not because the storms ended, but because I had walked out of them. Work, too, became different. I no longer carried the invisible exhaustion of family obligation into the office. My mind was clearer, my patience sharper, my ambition reignited. People noticed. A colleague once said to me, "You look lighter these days." He was right. I had shed years of emotional weight that never belonged to me, and in doing so, I had rediscovered parts of myself I thought were long gone. But freedom also invited reflection. There were nights when I lay awake, questioning how long I had let myself be blind. How many moments had I wasted being the dependable one, the one who sacrificed? How many opportunities had I declined out of fear that I might be selfish? That word had haunted me my whole life. Yet now I realized the truth. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Claire, meanwhile, continued to orbit on the edges of my world. I heard, through whispers, that she had moved into a cramped apartment, that her finances were strained. My brother, too, had lost credibility in his circles. The irony was sharp. They once leaned on me to appear stable, yet without me their instability revealed itself. And though some part of me felt a pang of sorrow, a larger part felt something I had never known before: peace without guilt. This was the beginning of a new chapter. Not about proving them wrong, not about watching them fall, but about watching myself rise. I realized revenge was only ever a doorway. What mattered was what came after, a life built not on resentment but on choice, my choice. And for the first time in years, I was finally choosing me. It happened on a grey Sunday afternoon. I was leaving the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I heard a voice call my name. I turned, and there was Claire. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes tired, her posture carrying the weight of someone who had been fighting battles on too many fronts. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world around us carried on, shopping carts clattering, car doors slamming, the buzz of ordinary life. Yet in that instant, everything narrowed to the unresolved tension between us. She stepped closer, her tone sharp, but laced with desperation. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said. "You blindsided me. You humiliated me." Her words were meant to cut, but they didn't land the way she expected. I stood still, breathing slowly, watching her carefully. I realized then that she wasn't angry about the house. She was angry that her illusion had shattered. Her entire story about entitlement, about certainty, had collapsed in front of an audience she never expected to disappoint. I could have argued back. I could have told her every story of sacrifice, every instance where I had given without return, every moment I had swallowed my pride to preserve hers. But I didn't. I simply let her words hang in the air. Silence, I'd come to understand, is heavier than any accusation. And in that silence, her own voice betrayed her. She shifted uncomfortably, her anger faltering, her expression softening into something closer to regret. Finally, I spoke calmly, evenly, without a tremor in my voice. "Claire, I didn't humiliate you. I just stopped protecting a lie." I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned, placed the groceries in my car, and drove away. That was the first time in my life I had walked away from her, without the familiar pull of guilt chasing me. On the drive home, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not bitterness, but clarity. Her confrontation had proven what I already knew. I no longer owed her explanations. I no longer owed her rescue. The weight was gone, and the absence of that weight felt like wings. When I pulled into my driveway, I stood in the quiet of my home and realized something profound. Peace isn't won in battles, it's won in the decision to stop fighting wars that were never yours, and in that moment, I knew I had already won. Betrayal has a way of teaching lessons no book or sermon can ever fully capture. In the quiet that followed Claire's confrontation, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table late one night, a glass of water in hand, staring at nothing. I thought about the years I had given freely, the blind spots I had chosen not to see. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always come with a knife in the back. It often comes with a smile, with familiar voices, with the word family used like a chain instead of a bond. Looking back, the signs had been there all along. The late-night calls asking for just a little help. The way my siblings' gratitude always felt thin, like an afterthought rather than a genuine acknowledgement. The casual entitlement in their voices when they said things like, "Daniel will take care of it." I had mistaken all of it for love. But love, real love, doesn't demand your silence or your sacrifice. Real love meets you halfway. The bitter truth was this: I wasn't betrayed once. I was betrayed slowly, repeatedly, in small doses. I taught myself to ignore. And that was the hardest part to accept, that I had been complicit by saying nothing, by swallowing my frustration, by convincing myself that this was just how family works. I had paved the very road that led to that dinner table declaration. My silence had protected them, but it had also erased me. Yet in that realization, something powerful took root. Betrayal had been my teacher, but wisdom was my reward. I began to understand the necessity of boundaries, not as walls to keep others out, but as gates to guard my own soul. A gate that lets in what is healthy and keeps out what corrodes. A gate that says, I am worthy of respect, and I will no longer trade my dignity for belonging. I thought often about loyalty. For so long I had equated loyalty with endurance, enduring mistreatment, enduring manipulation, enduring expectation. But now I saw loyalty differently. True loyalty is not to others at the expense of yourself. True loyalty begins with honoring your own worth. When you betray yourself, you leave the door wide open for others to follow. And so, betrayal became a strange kind of gift. Painful, yes. Costly, absolutely. But in its sting, it revealed a truth I might never have discovered otherwise, that strength is not in carrying everyone else's weight, but in learning when to set it down. Rebuilding didn't happen with grand gestures. It started with the smallest of choices, almost invisible to anyone but me. I began by reclaiming my mornings. For years I had woken up with a sense of heaviness, always wondering whose problem I'd have to solve next. But now, I brewed my coffee slowly, sat by the window, and watched the world wake up without asking anything of me. That small ritual, quiet and simple, reminded me that life was mine to savor, not just endure. I found myself exploring new places I had always ignored. Bookstores became sanctuaries, parks became retreats. I signed up for a woodworking class at the community center, something I had always told myself I was too busy for. Each cut of wood, each joint fitted carefully together, mirrored what I was doing with my life, rebuilding, shaping, creating something strong and lasting with my own hands. For the first time, I wasn't constructing for others. I was building for me. Relationships, too, began to change. Without the constant noise of obligation, I discovered space for genuine connection. Friends who once felt like background voices became companions I truly heard. Conversations were lighter, laughter more real, because I wasn't carrying invisible burdens into every room. And in those connections, I began to feel a sense of belonging, that wasn't bought with sacrifice, but offered freely in respect. Of course, there were moments of loneliness. Years of living as the reliable one had left me unsure of how to exist without someone needing me. But I learned to welcome that loneliness as part of the rebuilding. It was the empty space where new growth could take root. I realized that solitude isn't emptiness, it's preparation, and in that solitude, I was finally meeting myself again. One day, as I worked in my garden, a neighbor walked by and complimented the flowers I had planted. I smiled, thanked them, and after they left, I stood there for a long time staring at the blooms. It struck me, the house I once sold wasn't the loss I thought it was. The true home I had been searching for was never in brick and wood. It was here, within me, in the way I chose to live, to grow, to stand unshaken. Rebuilding wasn't about starting over, it was about finally starting right, and as I laid each piece of this new life into place, I knew I had stepped into a chapter my family could no longer write for me. This was my story now. It was late afternoon when I saw him again, my brother. I had stopped at a small cafe downtown, a place I'd begun frequenting for its quiet charm and the way sunlight spilled across the wooden tables. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed him walk in. His shoulders carried a heaviness I hadn't seen before, his eyes restless, searching the room as though even the air held judgment. When his gaze landed on me, there was a flicker of relief mixed with something like shame. He approached cautiously, coffee in hand, and sat down without asking. For a while, neither of us spoke. I let the silence stretch, not out of spite, but because silence had become my shield. Eventually, he exhaled heavily and said, "You've changed." The words weren't an accusation. They were an observation, tinged with something he couldn't quite name. I looked at him, calm, steady, and replied, "No." I finally stopped pretending. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the window. Then, in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard from him, he admitted, "I didn't realize how much we leaned on you until you stepped away." There was no apology in his tone, not exactly. It wasn't contrition, it was recognition. He had seen the cracks in his own life widen. Once my presence was no longer patching them, for the first time he acknowledged the truth I had carried for years. I was their foundation, and they had mistaken it for entitlement. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply nodded and let his words sit between us. He was expecting me to fill the silence, to comfort him the way I always had. But I didn't. That was the test. Could I sit in that moment without stepping back into the role they had written for me? And as the seconds passed, I realized I could. Finally, I spoke, my voice firm but calm. "We all build our own lives. I can't keep building yours for you." His face tightened, as though the words stung. But beneath the sting there was acceptance. He nodded once, finished his coffee, and left without another word. I watched him go, feeling neither victory nor sorrow, only clarity. As I sat there, the weight of that moment settled in me like a stone in a river, still, unshakable. This was the closure I didn't know I needed. Not dramatic, not loud, but quiet and final. The bond had shifted, and in that shift, I realized I had passed the last test of my silent revenge. The ability to stand strong without bending back into who I used to be. Peace didn't come all at once. It came in layers, like peeling back years of paint to reveal the original wood underneath. With every quiet boundary I set, with every silence I refused to fill, I felt more of my true self returning. The man who had once been overshadowed by obligation now stood taller, clearer, lighter. I realized that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to survive it. In the months that followed, I built a rhythm of life that belonged only to me, mornings with coffee and sunlight, evenings with books and long walks, weekends spent learning new skills, meeting people who valued me, not for what I could provide, but for who I was. Each moment was a quiet revolution, a declaration that I no longer lived in the shadows of other people's demands. I was no longer the dependable brother who never said no. I was Daniel, a man who had learned the cost of silence and the greater power of using it wisely. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought of Claire. I wondered if she had found stability, if she had finally learned to build her own life without reaching for someone else's foundation. I didn't wish her harm. I didn't wish my brother harm either. In truth, I wished them clarity. The same clarity I had been forced to find. But whether they found it or not was no longer my burden to carry. Their lives were theirs, and mine was finally mine. I began to notice a strange shift within myself. Where bitterness might have taken root, there was only stillness. Where revenge might have hardened me, wisdom had softened me instead. I didn't need to prove anything to them, because I had already proven something far greater to myself, that self-respect is worth more than approval, and boundaries are worth more than applause. The family still gathered, though less frequently. When I did attend, I carried no tension in my chest, no need to brace myself. I sat at the table, calm and unshaken. A man who no longer feared being misunderstood, and when questions rose, when old patterns tried to creep back in, I met them with silence, not the silence of surrender, but the silence of strength. My story began with betrayal, but it ended with freedom. I learned that the quietest revenge is not in destroying others. It is in refusing to let them destroy you. And as I closed this chapter of my life, I understood at last peace isn't something you find, it's something you create, moment by moment, decision by decision, until one day you look around and realize you are free.